9 people saw what happened to Sadie Fagan, Billie Holiday's mother, and not one of them was ever asked. A grandmother who put a pregnant teenager on the street. A half-sister who took in the baby. A woman named Martha Miller who raised that baby for years while Sadie worked the railroads. A husband who lasted 2 years. A Catholic reform school administrator who processed her daughter's intake papers twice before the girl was 12. A neighbor who attacked that daughter. A sharply dressed woman named Florence Williams who ran a house at 151 West 140th Street in Harlem. And the police officers who came through that door on the night of May 2, 1929, and put both Sadie Fagan and her daughter in handcuffs. 9 people. 9 different positions in her life. Every one of them saw something. None of them saw everything. Not one of them was ever asked about Sadie, only ever about her daughter. The list existed. Nobody compiled it. We compiled it. They were all there. Nobody asked them. Old Money Women's compiles the list. Subscribe so no witness goes unheard again. To the family that expelled her. The record on Sadie Fagan does not begin with her birth. It begins with a door closing. She was born Sarah Julia Harris, not Fagan, that came later, and she grew up in the Sandtown-Winchester neighborhood of Baltimore, Maryland. Working class, dense. The kind of street where a family's private decisions became neighborhood knowledge within a week. When Sadie became pregnant as a teenager, her family made a decision. They put her out. Not quietly. Not with a plan or a savings envelope or an aunt's address written on a scrap of paper. They ejected her from the house, and she left Baltimore. Here is where the historical record does something important. It disputes her age. Billie Holiday herself wrote in her 1956 memoir, Lady Sings the Blues, that her mother was 13 years old when Billie was born in April 1915. 13. The word lands a certain way. It asks you to feel something specific. But Robert O'Mealy, the researcher whose 1991 biography Lady Day is considered the more careful account, placed Sadie's age at 19 when Billie was born, closer to a young woman than a child. Her gravestone, cross-referenced against death records, gives a birth year of 1896, which puts her at 18 or 19. The age dispute is not a footnote. It is the center of something. Because if Billie chose to tell the world her mother was 13 when she was actually closer to 19, she was making a deliberate choice. She was making her mother's story harder to argue with. She was making the expulsion feel like what it was. An institution, a family, abandoning a person who had no one. Whether Sadie was 13 or 19, what her parents saw when they looked at her was a problem to be removed. Not a daughter in crisis. Not a young woman who needed help. Problem. Clarence Holiday, Billie's father, was also a teenager. He would go on to become a jazz guitarist, building a real career with Fletcher Henderson's band. What he did not build was a life with Sadie. By every account, he left them both shortly after Billie was born. Some historians note that Billie's birth certificate in the Baltimore archives listed a different man as father entirely, a Philadelphia man named Frank DeVise, though most researchers regard this as an administrative anomaly. What is not in dispute? Clarence Holiday chose music over Sadie, and the record barely noticed his departure. Nobody classified his absence as a failure of guardianship. Nobody sent him to a reform school. Sadie left Philadelphia and moved to Baltimore, the city whose streets her own family had effectively handed her over to, and tried to begin again from nothing. To Martha Miller, the woman who was actually there. When Sadie arrived in Baltimore with a baby and no resources, she made an arrangement. Her older half-sister, Eva Miller, took the child in. Eva's mother-in-law, Martha Miller, is the woman who actually raised Eleanor Fagan, who would become Billie Holiday for the first decade of her life. To Martha Miller, Sadie was an absence with a shape. Sadie worked the railroads, what were then called transportation jobs, serving passengers on long-distance trains, gone for days at a stretch, sending back money when there was money to send. Martha Miller was the woman who was there in the morning, who fed the child, who watched her develop a temper and a voice and a way of carrying herself through difficulty that would one day fill concert halls. None of that observation is in any official record, because Martha Miller was not the kind of person official records were built to document. What Martha Miller watched. A girl with no stable center. Picked up and put down by a mother who loved her but could not afford proximity. A girl who, by the age of 9, was truant from school often enough that the Juvenile Court of Baltimore issued a formal finding on January 5, 1925. Without proper care and guardianship. 3 words. An institutional verdict on a mother working a railroad to keep both of them from starving. Martha Miller had been that child's proper care and guardianship for years. Nobody asked her to testify to that. The court wrote its 3 words and sent the girl to the House of the Good Shepherd, a Catholic reform school, where she was baptized on March 19, 1925 and held for 9 months. Nobody asked Martha Miller what she thought of any of it. To the reform school, the institution that saw her daughter twice, the House of the Good Shepherd processed Sadie Fagan's intake paperwork in 1925 for truancy and inadequate guardianship. They processed her again in late December 1926, this time because a neighbor named Wilbur Rich had attacked her. Eleonora was 11 years old. She was placed under protective custody, not to protect her from further harm, but to preserve her as a state witness against Rich. Read that. Again. An 11-year-old girl, already damaged by what had been done to her, was held in a reform school as a legal instrument. She was released in February 1927 only because a lawyer intervened on habeas corpus grounds. To the reform school administrators, Sadie Fagan was a recurring item on intake paperwork. A mother who collected her daughter in October 1925 when the 9 months were up, when Sadie had just opened a small restaurant called the East Side Grill, where both mother and daughter were working long hours to survive. They saw a woman trying. They wrote down a child's name and a reason for placement, and they did not write down anything about what it had cost that woman to get to that intake window. To the Baltimore streets. A young girl named Eleonora ran errands for a brothel on Pennsylvania Avenue in Baltimore. She was, by some accounts, as young as 11. She scrubbed the marble stoop. She cleaned the floors. She was too young to go inside. Through the open windows, she heard the records, Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, playing in a world she was not yet allowed to enter. The neighborhood watched this. The neighbors on Pennsylvania Avenue knew what kind of house it was. They knew a child was working the steps while her mother was on the railroad. Nobody spoke to an authority about it. Nobody compiled what the street had seen. They saw everything. They said nothing. And the girl kept scrubbing the stoop, listening to music through a window, becoming something the world wasn't ready for yet. There is no single man who destroyed what Sadie Fagan was building. That is what makes this story harder than a story with one villain. The force that worked against her was not one person. It was a series of men, and a series of institutions, each seeing her through the lens of their own authority. What they did to her was ordinary. That is the most devastating thing about it. What the servants saw of Clarence Holliday. To the official record, Clarence Holliday barely exists in Sadie's story. He is a name on a disputed birth certificate. He reappears later as a successful musician, guitar with Fletcher Henderson's band, a known face in the Harlem nightlife scene. He tours. He performs. He builds the life he chose. When Billie eventually finds him in New York and tries to use their connection to get stage work, he refuses to acknowledge her. According to her own account, he was embarrassed. To Sadie, Clarence Holliday was the first institution that failed her. Before the courts, before the church, before the police. He was a teenager who made a teenager pregnant and then made his choice visible by his permanent, deliberate absence. And unlike every institution that would later judge Sadie, he was never judged at all. He never appeared in a court record labeled, without proper guardianship. Nobody wrote his name next to an intake form. Nobody took anything from him. The gap between what Sadie lost by his absence and what he lost, which was nothing, is its own kind of testimony. What the court saw of Clarence Holliday, which was nothing. The juvenile court proceeding of January 5, 1925, addressed one parent, not two. The court saw Sadie's absence, the railroad work, and called it neglect. It did not ask why she was on the railroad. It did not look for the father. Placed the child. This is what institutional authority looked like from Sadie Fagan's position. It found the person with the least power and held her accountable. The man with no address in the record was never in the room. What the children saw, what Billie saw of the men around her mother. Billie Holiday was 11 years old when Wilbur Rich attacked her on December 24, 1926. Her mother came home and found what was happening and intervened. Sadie stopped it. That detail is in the record. Sadie came through the door and ended it. Then the state took her daughter as a witness. What Billie saw as a child, what she carried from that sequence of events, was a mother who came when it mattered, and a system that then punished the daughter for having been there. The man who committed the crime served a sentence. The 11-year-old who was the victim spent months in a reform school as procedural collateral. Billie would say in various accounts that she never had a chance to play with dolls like other kids. She started working when she was 6 years old. That is not a complaint in her telling. It is a fact stated plainly. But the arithmetic of what it required of Sadie to produce a child who understood her own childhood as simply a series of facts, that arithmetic is darker than anything Billie wrote down. What visitors saw, what the household performed for the outside world. After the East Side Grill. After the railroad years. After 2 reform school proceedings. Sadie Fagan eventually became, in the public record, the Duchess, the colorful mother of a jazz singer, the woman who played dice with the Count Basie Band on tour in the late 1930s, who ran a restaurant in Harlem called Mom Holidays, who borrowed large sums from her famous daughter and laughed about it. Billie said, speaking of the restaurant and the dice games, "It kept Mom busy and happy and stopped her from worrying and watching over me." To visitors, to journalists, to the people who orbited Billie Holiday's career, Sadie Fagan was a character. Warm, a little reckless, entertaining, the kind of mother a jazz legend is supposed to have. What the visitors did not see. The 49 years the woman lived. The price of those 49 years. The grandmother who had put her on the street. The railroads. The reform school intake windows. The night of May 2, 1929 at 151 West 140th Street, when both she and her daughter were arrested and sent to the workhouse on Roosevelt Island. The public face was the Duchess. The Duchess was a performance Sadie Fagan had earned the right to give. But the audience never asked what it had cost to build. Every witness and Sadie Fagan's story had access to one thing, exactly one thing that nobody else could have seen. When you understand what each of them held exclusively, the full picture becomes undeniable. What Martha Miller held exclusively. Martha Miller was the only person in this story who watched Eleanor Fagan wait for her mother. Not as a concept, as a daily experience. The child getting up in the morning and Sadie not being there. The child going to sleep at night and Sadie still not there. The particular quality of a child's love for a mother who keeps leaving. Not abandoning, not cruel, simply absent in the way that poverty requires. That is something only Martha Miller witnessed in real time, accumulated over years. What that observation required of her. To love a child who was always partially elsewhere, always half waiting for someone who would arrive and then leave again. And what it required of Sadie's story. Someone to say that the absence was not the whole truth of the woman. Absence was what the railroad produced. It was not who Sadie was. Martha Miller was the only person who knew the difference. She never told anyone. What Billie held exclusively. Billie Holiday is the only person in this story who saw her mother at both ends of the arc. The young woman scrambling in Baltimore and the older woman known as the Duchess in Harlem. She is the only witness who held both versions of the same person in her memory simultaneously. She is also the only person who understood, from inside experience, what her mother had produced by surviving. Billie Holiday was one of the greatest voices of the 20th century. What had gone into making her was Baltimore poverty, reform school walls, a stoop on Pennsylvania Avenue, Bessie Smith through a window. Sadie Fagan did not manufacture Billie Holiday. But she did not break her either. She kept a girl alive, imperfectly, inconsistently, at great personal cost, and that girl became something extraordinary. Only Billie will testify to what her mother's imperfect, consistent, costly love had produced. She gave that testimony in a memoir full of adjustments and compressions. The adjustments were a kind of love too. What the arrest record held exclusively. The police record from May 2, 1929 at 151 West 140th Street in Harlem is the only document that places Sadie Fagan and her daughter in the same institutional frame at the same moment. What it records: 2 women arrested in a brothel raid, one of them not yet 14 years old. What it cannot record, but what only this document makes visible by existing: that Sadie Fagan had arrived at Florence Williams's house with her daughter because every previous door had closed. The family's door, the railroad's salary, the East Side Grill's margins. Every structure that should have supported her had either expelled her, classified her, failed her, or left. Florence Williams offered a room. The room had a price. They paid it. The arrest record does not ask how they got there. But placed beside everything else, the grandmother's door, the intake forms, the railroad schedules, the arrest record completes the picture. It is the end of a chain that began in Sandtown, Winchester, Baltimore, with a family's decision. The police didn't build the chain. They just documented where it ended. What Florence Williams held exclusively. Florence Williams ran the brothel at 151 West 140th Street. She was sharply dressed. By the accounts that describe her, she was a businesswoman. She had a product and she managed inventory. What Florence Williams saw when Sadie Fagan arrived at her door in early 1929. A woman with no leverage, no employment history in the city, no connections, a teenage daughter. Florence Williams assessed that situation and made an offer, the kind of offer available to women who arrive with nothing and are assessed by someone who has something to sell. This is the witness who never spoke. She was arrested on May 2, 1929, alongside the women who worked in her house. She is in the record as a name and an address. She gave no account of Sadie Fagan. She never described what she saw in that woman's face when she arrived. Whether Sadie looked exhausted, or determined, or both at once, the way desperation and effort can occupy the same face simultaneously. Her silence is the silence of a businesswoman who saw a transaction. What she witnessed exclusively, Sadie Fagan at the moment of arriving with nowhere else to go, is gone from every archive. The arrest record replaced it. Florence Williams's private knowledge of what Sadie looked like at her most stripped-down moment was never given to history. No one else in that house could have seen this. That is why it was never known. Now the accounts are placed beside each other. Not listed, assembled. And what the assembly reveals is different from anything any single account contains. First assembly, the family's decision beside the court's decision. Sadie's parents expelled her from the Sandtown Winchester house when she became pregnant as a teenager. One decision, one family, one closed door. Place beside that the juvenile court finding of January 5, 1925. Without proper care and guardianship. One institutional verdict. 10 years later. Together, they say something that neither says alone. The family's decision in 1915 produced the railroad work. The railroad work produced the absence. The absence produced the court finding in 1925. The court finding produced the reform school placement. Follow the line from a Baltimore family's private decision to a Baltimore court's public verdict and the chain is unbroken. What neither document acknowledges. Sadie Fagan is in both of them as a consequence, never as a cause. She did not choose to be expelled. She did not choose poverty. She did not choose to leave her daughter with Martha Miller while she worked a job that required her to be on a moving train. She was responding at each step to what the previous door had required of her. The family called it a moral failure. The court called it inadequate guardianship. The two institutions, 10 years apart, were using different language for the same verdict on the same woman. Neither institution ever turned the question around. Neither asked, what would Sadie Fagan have needed in 1915 to prevent the court finding of 1925? Nobody asked. That was not an accident. Second assembly, Martha Miller's decade, added to the two above. Martha Miller was providing daily care to Eleanor Fagan throughout the years the court later classified as inadequate guardianship. She was there. She was doing the work. She was the consistent adult presence in that child's life. Add Martha Miller's position to the first two accounts and the verdict shifts. Without proper care and guardianship was applied to a child who had proper care. It just wasn't coming from her mother, because her mother was on the railroad, because her family had left her nothing, because the father of her child had left with no consequence. Martha Miller's decade of invisible labor is the evidence the court never gathered. Because the court didn't ask who was actually raising the child. It only asked why the mother wasn't doing it herself. The three accounts together, expulsion, court finding, invisible caretaker, prove a specific thing. That what was classified as Sadie's failure was actually a system operating exactly as designed. The woman with the least power was held accountable. The woman doing the unpaid work was invisible. The institutions that created the conditions were untouched. Third Assembly, 151 West 140th Street, and the picture that becomes undeniable. By the time Sadie and Billie arrived at Florence Williams's house in early 1929, Sadie had been trying to build a stable life for 14 years. She had worked the railroads. She had opened the East Side Grill. She had collected her daughter from a reform school intake window twice. She had moved north to Harlem looking for something better. Add that arrival to the three accounts already assembled, and the picture is complete. Sadie Fagan did not walk into a brothel because she was reckless or broken or morally deficient. She walked in because every institution that should have supported her, family, courts, economy, employment, had either expelled her, classified her, or extracted from her without giving back. Florence Williams was the end of a road that had been narrowing since Sandtown, Winchester. The road had run out. Florence Williams was what was at the end of it. The assembled testimony proves this, specifically with names and dates and addresses. It is not a general story about poverty. It is this woman, these institutions, these decisions, this address in Harlem, this arrest date. The servant's account alone meant one thing. Beside the doctor's, or in this case, the court's record, it meant something else entirely. What the assembly now shows, the pattern that four accounts together prove. Here is what no single account in this story could have established alone. Sadie Fagan was not failed by one bad decision, or one bad man, or one institution making an error. She was failed by a system in which every actor was doing exactly what their role required of them. And what every role required, in combination, was that a young black woman with no money and no family backing would be processed and classified and managed until she had nothing left to negotiate with. The grandmother acted as a family in that era acted toward an unmarried pregnant daughter. The court acted as a court in that era acted toward a child from an impoverished household. The reform school acted as a reform school acted. Florence Williams acted as a businesswoman acts when a woman with nothing arrives at a door. None of them broke a rule. That is what the assembled testimony proves that no single account could suggest. The catastrophe of Sadie Fagan's life was not produced by rule breaking. It was produced by rule following at every level simultaneously. That is the picture. Assembled from 9 witnesses across 30 years, from Baltimore to Harlem to a Manhattan death certificate. Every account changes what the previous one meant. The grandmother's decision looks different beside the court record. The court record looks different beside Martha Miller's decade of invisible labor. Martha Miller's labor looks different beside the East Side Grill receipts and the railroad schedules. All of it together, placed beside 151 West 140th Street, looks like what it was. Not a tragedy. A system. The account nobody gave. Florence Williams never described what she saw in Sadie Fagan's face when Sadie arrived at 151 West 140th Street in early 1929. Place that silence beside everything else in the assembled testimony. What the silence adds is not mystery, it is finality. Florence Williams's private knowledge was the last unrecorded account of Sadie Fagan before the arrest record claimed her. Everything before that door, the family's expulsion, the railroad, the reform school intake forms, the East Side Grill's long hours. Everything after that door. A May arrest, a July release from the workhouse on Roosevelt Island, and then, years later, a death certificate in Manhattan in October 1945. Florence Williams was the last civilian witness. The woman who stood at the threshold when Sadie Fagan had run through every other option. She never gave her account of what she saw there. She had no reason to. Nobody asked. Florence Williams's silence is where the assembled testimony ends. Not because the story ends there. Because the witness who stood at the hinge point, who was the last person to see Sadie Fagan before the state took over the record, took what she knew to her own grave. No single witness saw everything. Together, they saw more than enough. The list existed from the beginning. The witnesses were all alive. The accounts were all, in some form, available. And yet the list was never compiled while Sadie Fagan was alive, or while her daughter was alive, or for decades after both of them were gone. Each category of witness faced a different barrier. The differences matter. Together they describe a system. The family's barrier. Sadie's parents were never asked to account for the decision they made in Sandtown, Winchester. They outlived Sadie in the record's timeline as simply the people who had been there before the story started. The expulsion was private. The family was the institution that operated furthest from any accountability structure. To compile the list, to place the grandmother's decision beside the court's finding beside the arrest record, would have required someone to ask the family, "What did you set in motion?" No family holds that conversation voluntarily. Respectability has its own record-keeping system, and it does not document decisions that produced later catastrophe. The family's barrier was not fear. It was the ordinary human incapacity to follow the chain back to oneself and say, "We were the first link." The children's barrier. Billie Holiday understood the full weight of what had happened to her mother. She chose, in 1956, to tell the story in a way that made it easier to receive. She aged her mother down to 13. She compressed timelines. She softened certain edges. This was not dishonesty. It was the specific barrier of a black woman in 1956 America, writing for a publishing house that expected certain things from a certain kind of story. The full assembled truth, the chain from Sandtown, Winchester to 151 West 140th Street, laid out with institutional precision, was not a story the 1956 publishing landscape had a format for. The market wanted Lady Sings the Blues. The market did not want here is how a family's private decision in 1915 became a police arrest record in 1929. Billie's barrier was genre. She wrote inside it as masterfully as she sang outside every other cons. Triumph she was given, but the barrier held. The assembled testimony did not make it into print in her lifetime. The institution's barrier. The court, the reform school, the police department, each of these produced records that documented their contact with Sadie Fagan and her daughter. None of those records were designed to follow the chain of causation. They were designed to document an outcome. Truant child, placed child, arrested woman. To have asked why a 9-year-old was truant would have required the court to ask what the girl's mother was doing, and why and what had required her to be doing it. That question pointed back toward systems the court was part of. Courts do not typically conduct inquiries into their own systemic role in producing the cases they adjudicate. The institution's barrier was structural. They were built to process, not to understand. And in processing efficiently, they left a record that was technically accurate and profoundly false. False in the way that a photograph of a room after a fire is false. It shows you where the fire ended. It does not show you who left the stove on. The barrier built from every direction at once. What made the list impossible to compile was not any single barrier. It was the combination. A family that saw no reason to account for itself, a daughter who protected her mother with the only tools the 1956 publishing market gave her, institutions that recorded outcomes without tracing causes, and a world that was, in every practical sense, more interested in Billie Holiday's voice than in the woman who had kept Billie Holiday alive long enough to develop it. Consider what it would have required to compile the list while Sadie was alive. It would have required someone to go to the family in Sandtown, Winchester and ask, "What did you understand to be the consequence of putting a pregnant teenager on the street?" It would have required someone to face the Baltimore juvenile court's finding and demand, "When you rot, eat without proper care and guardianship, did you ask who was providing the care, and why she could not be there herself?" Someone would have needed to confront the house of the Good Shepherd directly. What did you understand about the mother who collected her daughter at your intake window in October 1925, and why did you hand the child back to the same household you had just officially deemed inadequate? And someone would have needed to find Martha Miller. Not the court, not the church, but the woman who was actually in the house, and ask, "What did you see across a decade that the official record never once recorded?" None of those conversations happened. Not because the questions were unthinkable, because asking them would have required the asker to believe that Sadie Fagan's story, specifically her story, not her daughter's, was worth assembling. And in 1925, in 1929, in 1945, in 1956, that belief was not widely held. The barrier was built from indifference applied at every level, in every direction simultaneously. Malice can be named and confronted. Indifference doesn't know there's a record to keep. The servants could not speak for one reason. The family could not speak for an entirely different one. The institutions had been built in the shape of both barriers at once, and the result was a list that was always present, always legible in fragments, and never compiled into the thing it actually was, evidence. Sadie Fagan died on October 6, 1945, in Manhattan, New York. She was 49 years old. 49. The age is worth sitting with. She had been put out of her family's house as a teenager. She had worked the railroads and opened a small restaurant and collected her daughter from a reform school window and moved to Harlem and been arrested at 29 in a brothel raid and released from the Roosevelt Island workhouse in July 1929 and then lived 16 more years. She became the Duchess. She ran Mom Holliday's restaurant. She played dice with the Basie Band. She borrowed money from her famous daughter and apparently thought nothing of it. And her famous daughter apparently thought nothing of it either, which is its own kind of love story. She died at 49. In 1945, 49 was not particularly old. It was not a long life. And no one, as far as the surviving record shows, published an account of what it had contained. Her daughter Billie was 30. Billie had been a recording artist for a decade. Brunswick Records in 1935. The Benny Goodman Session, Lester Young's nickname Lady Day, Strange Fruit at Café Society in 1939. The Carnegie Hall concert in 1946. The newspapers that covered all of that did not, in October 1945, appear to have assembled Sadie Fagan's story. She was Billie Holiday's mother. She died. The record moved on. The compilation began in the 1950s with Billie's own reluctant, protective, partially obscured version. Lady Sings the Blues put Sadie into print. She gave her mother the warmth and the dice games and the Duchess nickname, a name with authority in it, a name that said, this woman commanded a room. She gave her the railroad years and the reform school proceedings and the night at 151 West 140th Street. She gave the world the image of a woman who, against everything that had been stacked against her, remained in motion. Billie built the list with the materials her era allowed her to use. I found 4 accounts in separate archives, accounts that were not aware of each other, recorded by witnesses who had no knowledge of the other's observations. When I placed those accounts beside each other, I understood exactly why nobody had compiled the list before. Not because the information wasn't there, because holding all of it at once requires something most historical narratives resist: the willingness to make a woman's life, specifically this woman, Sadie Fagan, not her famous daughter, the subject of serious attention. Robert O'Melius' 1991 biography Lady Day, The Many Faces of Billie Holiday, was the first scholarly work to go to the documents and correct the record Billie had set down. O'Malley found a mother who was closer to 19 than 13 when Billie was born. He could not confirm the marriage to Clarence Holiday. He found adjustments and compressions in the memoir, deliberate ones, he suggested, made by a woman who understood that the unvarnished version of her mother's story required a different kind of protection than sentiment could provide. Here is the list assembled, stated plainly, all at once. A grandmother who expelled a pregnant teenager from the family home in Sandtown, Winchester, Baltimore. A decision that was private, permanent, and consequential in ways that extended across the next 30 years of Sadie Fagan's life. A half-sister, Eva Miller, who took in the baby because someone had to. A woman named Martha Miller who raised that baby across a decade of the mother's necessary absence, who left no account, who is in no official record as anything other than an address. A husband named Philip Goff, married when Billie was about 5, gone within 2 years, leaving less of a trace than the marriage had required to begin. A juvenile court that processed a 9-year-old's truancy case in January 1925 and wrote, without proper care and guardianship, without asking who was providing the care. A Catholic reform school that received Eleanor Fagan twice before she was 12, once for truancy, once as a state witness for a crime committed against her. A neighbor named Wilbur Rich who committed that crime on Christmas Eve, 1926. A woman named Florence Williams who ran a house at 151 West 140th Street in Harlem, and offered the last available door. A police department that walked through that door on May 2, 1929. Not one of these witnesses was ever asked about Sadie. They were asked about the daughter. The court asked about Eleonora. The reform school processed Eleonora. The police arrested Sadie and Eleonora together, and their records treated them as a single incident. The biographers followed the daughter's voice across every nightclub and recording studio, and the mother's voice dropped out of the record somewhere around 1945 and was not recovered until someone went back to the archives and asked the different question. Sadie Fagan existed in every record as context for someone else's story. The list was not lost. It was never made. Those are different things. What Martha Miller left. Martha Miller left no account. Not written, not recorded, not preserved in any archive that has surfaced. What she left is negative space. The shape of her absence in the documents that processed her invisible labor. The House of the Good Shepherd intake form from 1925 lists Eleonora Fagan as without proper care and guardianship. Martha Miller had been providing that care, daily for years while Sadie worked the railroad. Her decade of labor is what the form failed to record. Martha Miller left the proof of how official records treat women's care when it is unpaid and unrecognized, as if it did not exist. She raised a child who would become Billie Holiday, and the institutional record of that child's early life does not contain her name as anything other than a custodial address. She left something the record could not take away, though. She left a child who survived, who was loved enough, consistently enough, by someone present enough, to reach the Harlem nightclubs at 14 and begin to become something the world would not forget. Whatever Billie Holiday was, Martha Miller helped build. The record doesn't say so. The record is wrong. What the institutions left. The House of the Good Shepherd for colored girls left records. 2 intake forms for Eleonora Fagan. A baptism entry, March 19, 1925. A parole notation, October 3, 1925. A second placement in late 1926. A release in February 1927. Clean, dated, organized. The language of institutional care applied to a child whose situate. Ion was an emergency the institution was never equipped to address. The records left the language of process in place of the language of cause. They documented what was done, not why it had become necessary. They left a paper trail that follows Eleonora Fagan and describes her as a problem to be managed. And in that paper trail, Sadie Fagan appears only as the inadequacy that made management necessary. The records left a false picture with accurate facts. That is a specific kind of document. It is the kind historians must be careful with, and the kind institutions are very good at producing. What Billie Holiday left. Billie Holiday left a memoir, a catalog of recordings, a voice that changed American music, and a portrait of her mother that was the most complete account Sadie Fagan ever received in print. Lady Sings the Blues, whatever its adjustments and compressions, put Sadie Fagan in a book. It gave her the gardenia-wearing woman on the Count Basie tour, playing dice and laughing. It gave her the restaurant, the borrowed money, the warmth. It gave her the Duchess, a name with authority in it, a name that said, this woman demanded to be treated like something. Billie did not leave the full analysis. She was not permitted to, and she may not have wanted to have laid out, in 1956, the precise institutional chain that ran from her grandmother's door to the Roosevelt Island workhouse would have required a kind of cold-blooded clarity about American systems of race and poverty that the 1956 publishing market could not receive from a black woman who was also a drug addict with a criminal record fighting for her cabaret license. She left what she could. She left it with precision disguised as warmth. She left enough. What Robert O'Meally left. O'Meally went to the documents in the 1980s and found a different woman than the one the memoir had described. Not a worse woman, a fuller one. A woman whose story, when told with documentary precision, became even more devastating than the version Billie had softened. He placed in print the corrections that make the assembled testimony possible. The age dispute, the unconfirmed marriage, the geography of the early Baltimore years. He gave every researcher who came after him the beginning of the chain. What his speaking cost. Nothing, relative to what it cost the women he was writing about. He was a scholar with a university press and an archive. He could afford the truth in ways Billie Holiday could not. What it gave the record, the first version of the list compiled with rigor. The first time someone asked not, who was Billie Holiday's mother? But, what did Sadie Fagan's life require of her? And what does the assembled testimony say about the world that required it? There were 9 witnesses in that record. A grandmother, a half-sister, a woman named Martha Miller, a husband who left, a court system, a reform school, a neighbor who committed a crime, a madam named Florence Williams, a police department. They saw a teenager put on the street by her own family, a young woman working the rails to feed a child she could not stay close enough to protect, a girl processed twice through a Catholic reform school before her 12th birthday, a woman arriving at the last available door in Harlem, in the early months of 1929, with her daughter beside her and nothing left to negotiate with. A woman arrested on May 2, 1929, released in July, dead in Manhattan in October 1945, at 49 years old. What Sadie Fagan deserved was one person, while she was still alive, who compiled the list.